Hey guys, it's Miss Mac, and of course we're reading Chains, and today we're reading chapter 9. So grab your books, I'll give you a second. We're going to be starting on page 53, so everybody should be on page 53. Let's go, chapter 9. Thursday, June 6, 1776. Hundreds in this New York colony are active against us, and such is the weakness of the government, if it can deserve the name, that the Tories openly profess their sentiments in favor of the enemy and live unpunished. Letter of William Tudor, Washington's chief legal officer, to John Adams. And remember, Halls Anderson, who's the author of this book, starts each of her chapters with a primary source document or something from a primary source document in order to stamp the time period, okay? So that's a technique that she uses to let you know the time period that we find ourselves in as we read Chains. So let's get started. I was stuck on the back steps with a pile of dull knives and a whetstone. It was a dreary job. First, spit on the stone. Next, hold the knife at the proper angle and circle it against the stone. 10 to the left, 10 to the right, until the blade was sharp enough to slice a joint of beef like it was butter. As I sharpened, I imagined using the knife to cut through the ropes that tied us to New York. I'd slice through the ocean, and Ruth and me would walk on the sand all the way home. 10 circles to the left. Ruth was above stairs, standing whilst Madame prepared herself for company. The master was locked in his library. Becky was somewhere in the crowd watching General Washington's parade down Broadway with 5 regiments of soldiers. The sounds of beating drums and whistling fifes and cries of "Huzza! Huzza!" blew toward me over the rooftops. I pushed everything out of my mind, save my task. 10 circles to the right. So I want to just give you an idea of what she's doing. She has a block. It's like a sharpening block, sort of like this. It's called a whetstone. And what she's doing is she's sharpening knives. So she goes 10 circles to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or however many. And then this way. And in doing that, you sharpen the knife. So just a little visual so that you guys have an idea of what she's doing. And there's a parade happening because Washington's troops, or the rebel troops, have taken over New York City, and there's a huge parade going on right now. Becky came back from the parade an hour later, overflowing with stories. She nattered on about the spectacle whilst assembling the tea things for Madame and Lady Seymour, who had come to call. I pretended to listen. Truth be told, I didn't notice when she left carrying the tray. 10 circles to the left, 10 circles to the righty, all make the blade sharp and mighty. 10 circles to the left, 10 circles to the right. Becky called for me twice before I heard her proper. Her voice was high and tight. I said, hurry. You want to get me put in the street? Madam wants you in the parlor. The knife near slipped from my hands. Is it Ruth? No, Lady Seymour wants to see you. And the master just arrived with gentlemen friends, all calling for food and drink. Hurry. I washed up in the cold water bucket, quickly pinned on a clean apron, checked my kerchief was on proper, and followed Becky to the parlor. She rapped lightly on the door and pushed it open. The new girl, ma'am, she said, setting a plate of fresh-baked strawberry tarts on the table. Show her in, Madam said. Becky waved at me to enter. Madam and an older woman sat at the table, but my eyes were drawn between them to my sister, dressed up as Madam's pretty pet in a bleached linen shift, a navy blue brocade short gown, and a full skirt patterned with lilacs. When she saw me, she clenched her hands together and bit her lower lip. Her eyes were red and swollen with crying. So now we have this theme again of loyalty, and we talked about this a couple of days ago. Who is Isabel really loyal to? And who is her number one concern? Ruth. So I would do a gist right there in your book, and you really can't see it because the video is acting wonky, but I would underline her lower lip, her eyes were red and swollen with crying. I would underline that, and my gist would be loyalty, concern for Ruth. Okay, that's a very important theme, and that is loyalty. And we understand that Isabel's main loyalty, in spite of the position that she finds herself in, is to her sister Ruth. Okay? My belly went funny and my mind raced. Why had she been crying? Was she sick? Scared? Did Madame hurt her? Becky poked me gently in the back. This was not the time for questions. I quickly dropped into a curtsy, bowing my head. When I stood up, the older woman, the lady aunt with all the money, gave me a shadow of a smile. She was smaller than Madame and wore a silk gown the color of mourning dove and gray lace gloves. Her hair was curled high and patterned snow white. A necklace set with black stones shone from her neck. There were deep lines at the corners of her eyes and around her mouth, but I couldn't tell if they were from laughing or from crying. So remember when we were reading The Outsiders, we talked about characterization, and we know that characterization is a process for describing or creating a character. It's a craft move, an author's craft move. And here, what the author is doing is giving you a physical description of Lady Seymour. Now, sometimes we learn things about our characters through dialogue. Sometimes we learn things about our characters through what other characters say about them or how they interact with other characters. But here, the craft move that Hals Anderson is using is just simply description. So I would draw sort of a parentheses around that whole paragraph, and I would just Lady Seymour characterization or description. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to gist. And remember, tomorrow on Tuesday, I will be checking gists. So just make sure that you're gisting as we go along. I'll give you a couple of more seconds. And let's continue on page 55, middle of page 55. She turned her chair and looked at Ruth, then back at me. And these two girls are sisters? She asked. Madame reached for a tart. That's what the man said. The older woman sipped her tea. What is your name, girl? She asked me. Isabel, ma'am, I said. Isabel Finch. Okay, let's stop right there. Let's underline Isabel Finch, or circle it or highlight it. Let's go ahead and do that now. And then draw an arrow and write previous owner Mary Finch. And oftentimes what happened is that a slave wouldn't have their name, the name that they were born with, or their African name. They would take on the names of their owners. So if you were owned by Finches, your last name, or as they called it in those days, your surname would become Finch. And so Isabel sees herself as Isabel Finch. Let's go back. Isabel, ma'am, I said. Isabel Finch. Ridiculous name, Madame said. She opened her fan and waved it in front of her face. You are called Sal Lockton. It's more suitable. Okay, hold the phone. Did she just change her name? Okay, that's the highest shade, the highest disrespect. So basically, she just changed her name from Isabel to Sal Lockton, and there's nothing that Isabel/Sal can do about it. Again, we talked about the dehumanization of slaves, or the dehumanization of enslaved people. And this is a perfect example. So you should highlight, you are called Sal Lockton now, or underline, and then your gist in your margin should be Mrs. Lockton changes Isabel's name. Okay? Let's continue. I forced myself to breathe in slow and regular instead of telling her that my name was not her affair. Yes, ma'am. She glanced at my feet. And you must wear shoes. This is a house, not a barn. Ruth stepped out of the corner. Isabel? Madame snapped her fan shut and rapped it against the edge of the table, startling us all. What did I tell you about silence? She said roughly. Ruth raised one shaking finger to her mouth and said, Shh. Precisely. Madame set the fan in her lap and reached for a piece of sugar with silver tongues. When she plopped it in the cup, the tea overflowed into the saucer. Ruth stood there like a carved statue, her fingers still held to her lips. I took another breath, slower than the first, and tried not to think on the newly sharpened knives on the kitchen steps. Lady Seymour curled her fingers around her teacup, her gaze marking first Madam, then Ruth, then me. She said nothing. Would you like Sal to serve you and Lady Seymour while I wait on the gentleman? Becky asked. Absolutely not. Show her the library and make sure the men are fed. And bring fresh tea. This has already gone cold. We curtsied and left the parlor. Ruth's sad eyes followed me to the door. 10 circles to the left, 10 circles to the righty. All make the blade sharp and mighty. Now let's stop here for a second. Why do you think the author goes back to that little chant that Isabel was doing while she was sharpening the knives? Think about that for a moment. She hasn't seen her sister all day. She comes into the parlor. When her sister tries to speak or approach her, Madame Lockton shuts it down. And then she notices that her sister looks as if she's been crying. And she's just wondering, has she been hurt? Has Madame Lockton done something to her? And immediately her mind goes back to those knives. So let's continue. Middle of page 56. Back in the kitchen, Becky took a large silver tray off the high shelf in the pantry. Hold this. She loaded the tray with plates of cold sliced tongue, cheddar cheese, brown bread, and a bowl of pickles. I could not stop thinking about the way Ruth had jumped when Madame shouted, nor the tears in her eyes. Again, let's underline that. I could not stop thinking about the way Ruth had jumped. Again, we see Isabel's concern for her sister. Becky took down a second tray and set upon it 4 goblets. So goblet, circle that. Goblet, that's a vocab word. A goblet is a fancy glass, okay? And 2 bottles of wine and a crock of mustard. She swung the kettle back over the fire to heat up more water, picked up the tray with the wine, and said, "Hop to." I followed her to the front of the house. But what about my shoes? The master won't notice long as he gets his grub. Okay, grub is food, so circle grub at the bottom of page 56. Grub is food. Think about Seamless, Grubhub, those apps that you use to order food. Grub is food. Becky balanced the edge of the tray on her hip and knocked on the door on the right side of the front hall. When a deep voice answered, she opened it. Lockton looked up as we entered. Oh, good. Sustenance. Circle sustenance. I'll give you a moment. And can you use your context clues to figure out what sustenance is? Write a gist for what you think sustenance is. Do that. Remember, I'm going to be checking your annotations and gists on Tuesday, tomorrow, and there could be a quiz. Okay, let's continue. Lockton looked up as we entered. Oh, good, sustenance, he said, pushing aside a stack of newspapers to clear off the desk. The room was the same size and shape as the parlor, but 2 of the walls had bookcases built into them. A large painting of horses jumped over a high hedge on the 3rd wall. A thin layer of dust lay over everything. The front windows were open, bringing in fresh air and noise from the street. Carts rolling over the cobblestones and church bells in the distance mingled with the voices of the 4 men who sat around the enormous desk. One man looked poorer than the others. The cuffs of his coat were frayed and his hands were stained with ink. Okay, so let's underline poorer than the others and cuffs of his coat frayed, and put a number 1 in your margin. That's the first person that's sitting around the desk with Mr. Lockton. Next to him sat a man with suspicious gray eyes and a liver-colored coat, with a double row of gold buttons fastened over his large pudding belly. That's man number 2. Underline, suspicious gray eyes and a liver-colored coat. That's the second person. The 3rd man wore something on his head that looked more like a dead possum than a wig. But his coat was crisp and new, and the buckles on his shoes gleamed. That's person number 3. Okay, so we have 3 men. We have the one whose cuffs of his coat were frayed. We have the second man with the suspicious gray eyes. And we have a 3rd man who wore something like a possum. A possum is like a huge squirrel on his head, but his clothes were nice and new. And then the 4th was Master Lockton, looking like a cat who had just swallowed the last bite of a juicy mouth. Becky set her tray on the sideboard. I held mine as she poured the wine and served the gentleman. Then she had me hold the food tray so she could serve the tongue and cheese. Talk halted as the men started in on their meal. "Becky!" Madam called across the hall. "Go see her," Lockton told Becky. "The girl can stay here. Does she know where the wine is?" "Yes, sir," I said. Becky and Lockton both stared at me. I had spoken out of turn. Again, we see this dehumanization of enslaved people. Slaves are treated like pets, like property, like animals. And she spoke out of turn. So you weren't allowed to speak unless someone spoke to you, unless someone asked you a question or gave you an order. So when she says, "Yes, sir," she quickly remembers, I had spoken out of turn. My job was to be silent and follow orders. Ruth had already learned that. "Shh. Keep the wine flowing and the plates full," Lockton said. "My friends eat more at my table than their own." As Becky left, Gold Buttons drained his wine, then raised his goblet. I hurried to pour him another and topped off the drinks of the other men. Lockton gave me a curt nod when I was finished. "Stand over there," he said, pointing to the corner where the two bookshelves met each other. I gave a wordless curtsy and took my place. Let's underline here this gist. Again, we're looking at this dehumanizing treatment of slaves. "Stand over there," he said, pointing to the corner. Let's circle or underline or highlight that. And then the gist, I would write rude, very dismissive of Ruth. I gave a wordless curtsy and took my place. The men dove back into their conversations. "Who has been arrested because of the oath?" demanded Lockton. "Fools unschooled in the art of fence-sitting," said Gold Buttons. "Plank walking, you mean," said Inkstained. Shabby Wig leaned forward and pointed his finger at Inkstained. "Don't you turn coward on us, not when we're this close." "Close?" argued Inkstained. "Did you see His Majesty's ships in the harbor?" "I don't. I might argue that England has fled and the rebel traders have won." So let's stop and think about what's happening here. So we know we're on the heels of the American Revolution, and we know that there are two sides. There are colonists in the colonies, and one set of colonists supports the king and supports continuing to be ruled by England. And the other set of colonists are like, "Wait, you guys are across the other side of the world. Why should we be ruled by England?" And those are the rebels or the patriots. And so Mr. Lockton and his friends, who are obviously loyalists, are discussing this. "Lower your voices," Lockton said with a scowl. He closed the windows with a loud bang, then returned to his seat. "His Majesty's ships are very close, closer than you know. The rebellion will be smashed like glass under a heavy boot, and the king will be very grateful for our assistance." The mention of the king caught my ear. I studied the wide boards on the wall and listened with care. Okay, let's stop right there. Underline the mention of the king caught my ear, and I studied the wide boards on the wall and listened with care. This reminds me of page 39. If you go back to page 39 and paragraph 3, that's when Curzon is asking Isabel to do exactly this, to listen unnoticed and bring information. So I wonder if Isabel is ready to spy for Curzon. Really interesting. Make sure you have that highlighted, underlined, or circled. And make sure you have a gist in the side, page 39. Curzon asks Isabel to spy. Gold Buttons popped a piece of cheese into his mouth and talked as he chewed. "I sincerely hope you speak the truth, Elihu." Elihu is Mr. Lockton's first name. "These rebel committees are multiplying faster than rabbits in the spring. They've just about ground business to a halt." So as a loyalist, he's talking about the fact. Now remember, when this chapter opens, Becky, who is one of the indentured servants, is at a parade. The Patriots have taken over New York, and General Washington, George Washington, is marching into New York. So this is what they're talking about. If you're a loyalist at this point and Patriots have taken over, then a lot of your activities have been stopped. A lot of your business has been stopped because the Patriots are in town. and are taking over. Have they interfered with you directly? Lockton asked. Every waking moment, Goldbutton said. The latest bit of nonsense is a committee to detect conspiracies. They sent the hounds after us, old friend. Have you written to Parliament? They need the specifics of our difficulties. Parliament is far away as the moon, complained Inkstain. So Parliament, I would circle Parliament here, and then just government in England. So just like we have a Congress and a Senate in England at that time, and actually now they still have a parliament, that was their governing body. As the other men argued about parliament and letters of protest and counter letters and counter letters, Shabby Wig stabbed at the last pieces of tongue on his plate and shoved them into his mouth. He turned in his seat to look at me, held up his plate, and grunted. If I had ever done such a thing, Mama would have switched my behind for having the manners of a pig. So underline switched my behind, that's the same thing as to spank or to get a pow-pow. Even Miss Mary Finch had asked with a please and a thank you when Mama served her dinner. This is New York, I reminded myself as I crossed the room and took the plate from his hand. The rules are different. I loaded his plate down with the last slices of tongue and set it in front of him before retreating to my corner. Everything is different. My belly growled and grumbled in its cage. The smell of the tongue and mustard and the cheese filled the room and made my mouth water. I had eaten a bowl of corn mush at sunrise and only dumplings at midday. To distract the beast in my gullet, I tried to read the names of the books on the shelves without turning my head. Okay, I love this line. To distract the beast in my gullet. So gullet is another word for belly or gut, her tummy. So underline to distract the beast in my gullet. What is that line telling us? Again, these are craft moves. The author could have said, I was really hungry. But again, authors use words, particular words, and particular sentence structures to create a certain mood for the reader or to conjure up an image in the reader's mind. And here, to distract the beast in my gullet, I tried to read the names of the books on the shelves without turning my head. So she's trying to think of something, distract herself from how hungry she is. All right, let's continue. My eyes were as starved for words as the rest of me was for dinner. It was hard to read from the side like that. I wanted to pull down a book, open it proper, and gobble up page after page. I wanted to stare into the faces of these men and demand that they take me home. I wanted to jump on the horse in the painting and fly over the hills. Most of all, I wanted to grab my sister by the hand and run as fast as we could until the cobblestones disappeared and there was dirt under our feet again. Girl, Lockton said, bring us more bread, sliced thin, and some of Becky's apricot jam. I've missed the taste of that. I curtsied and hurried out of the room, leaving the door open a crack so I could easily open it when I came back with my hands full. Across the hall came the quiet conversation of Madam and Lady Seymour. I paused, but heard no mention of Ruth. So again, we have Ruth. We have this very difficult treatment and dehumanizing treatment of Isabel. They're very dismissive. They're rude. They don't care. They're not thinking about how she feels or the fact that she hasn't eaten every day. Guys, just imagine how difficult that must have been. All right, we're on page 60. Make sure you're gisting and that you're keeping up. When I check gists on Tuesday, I'm going to be looking for very specific annotations based on our reading right now. Middle of page 60. Let's go. There was fresh bread on the kitchen table, but it took a piece of time to find the crock of jam. I used one of my sharp knives to slice the loaf, set out the slices on a clean plate, and put the plate and jam on the tray. It was taking me too long to finish a simple chore. I feared the master would be angry with me, and I was angry at myself for being afraid. I was just about to push open the library door with my foot when the master said, "Compliments of His Majesty, gentlemen. There's enough money here to bribe half the rebel army." I stopped and peered through the crack. Madam's linen chest. The one she had fussed about when we arrived was in the middle of the library floor, the top thrown open. Underskirts and shifts were heaped on the floor beside it. Lockton reached into the chest and pulled out 2 handfuls of paper currency. So now we're back to this chest. Remember this chest when they first arrived in New York? And the Patriot soldiers wanted to check the chest. They wanted to inspect it. And Madame Lockton refused and said her underthings were in there. And it was horrible for a man to go through a woman's things. And all the while, it's filled with money from England. Now, I wonder what that money is for. Stop for a moment and make a prediction. What do you think that money is for? Let's read on. Huzzah, said Inkstained, as Gold Buttons let out a low whistle. Do you have a man ready? Lockton asked. 2, Shabbywig answered. One will operate out of Corby's Tavern, and the other from Highlander. Good. Lockton crossed back to his desk. I could no longer see him, but his words were clear. Every man willing to switch sides is to be paid 5 guineas and 200 acres of land. If he have a wife, an additional 100 acres. Each child of his blood garners another 50. Makes me want to marry the next lady I clap eyes on, Gold Buttons said. Lockton chuckled. I gave the door a little push, and it swung open. Sir? I asked in a hushed tone. Enter, Lockton said. I walked in. The other men did not look my way. I was invisible to them until they needed something. Jam, he said with a smile. Put it right here. I placed the tray in front of him and took my place again in the corner. The men spread the jam on the bread and drank their wine, discussing politics and war and armies over the stacks of money on my master's desk. The smell of apricots filled the warm room. It put me in mind of the orchards down the road from Miss Mary's place. I kept my face still as a plaster mask, but inside my brain pan, thoughts chased round and round. By the time the men rose to leave, I knew what I had to do. That's the end of chapter 9. So I want you to do a couple of things. One, I want you to make sure that you do your CSCRT right here. Don't forget character, setting, conflict, resolution, and theme for chapter 9. And I want you to make a prediction about what you think Isabel is thinking about doing. Guys, that's all for right now. Hope you enjoyed. You better have your annotations and your gists. See you tomorrow in class.